welcome to the deep dive. If you were joining us today, you probably picture the ancient Mediterranean world like Greece and Rome as these, I don't know, pristine white marble societies.
Right, yeah, like philosophers just calmly debating in the forum or perfectly ordered armies marching in straight line.
Exactly. It all feels so rational and civilized. But today, we are looking at a stack of historical sources that completely shatter that illusion.
Oh, completely.
Our mission for this deep dive is to uncover how these ancient states engineered human behavior on just a massive scale. I mean, we are going to look at how they weaponized human intimacy, completely rewrote their own religious mythology, and used divine law to build unbreakable armies.
And, maintain strict civic control over you, the citizen.
Yeah.
It really is a profound shift in perspective because we so often read ancient myths simply as like entertaining stories about gods and heroes.
Right, just ancient fiction.
Exactly. But the historical material we're analyzing today reveals those myths as highly engineered political tools. They were calculated mechanisms designed from the top down to define gender roles, enforce mandatory military duty, and honestly, forge national identity out of thin air.
And the sheer scale of this manipulation is what blows my mind.
Yeah.
Because we're going to explore everything from an elite Greek military unit composed entirely of romantic couples to how Rome literally used the flight patterns of birds to filibuster their own political elections.
Which is still wild to think about.
It's crazy. And we'll even get into how the very biological concept of youth was seized and turned into a state-owned resource.
But to really understand how they engineered this control, we have to start on the battlefield.
Okay, let's do it.
Because military survival was really the engine driving all of this. Specifically, we need to look at ancient Greece in the early 4th century BCE.
Right, so let's set the stakes for the listener here. For generations, Sparta was the terrifying, undisputed heavyweight champion of the Greek world.
Oh, without a doubt.
If you saw a Spartan army marching toward your city, you essentially surrendered or died. But then a rival city-state named Thebes decides to challenge that supremacy. And around 378 BCE, Thebes creates a military unit called the Sacred Band.
And the Sacred Band of Thebes is arguably one of the most fascinating military formations in human history.
Yeah.
It was an elite shock troop unit consisting of exactly 150 pairs of male lovers, so 300 soldiers in total.
Wow.
And the underlying psychology that the Theban commanders tapped into was brilliantly, almost ruthlessly pragmatic. They operated on the belief that soldiers who were bound together by passionate romantic love and sexual partnership would display a level of courage in combat that you simply couldn't train into a normal recruit.
Right, because, I mean, if you're a standard soldier, maybe you are fighting for a paycheck, or maybe you are just terrified of your commander. But if the battle turns against you, your instinct is to drop your shield and run. The Sacred Band changes the calculus completely. It's like taking that psychological phenomena of a mother lifting a car off her trapped child and militarizing it.
That is a great analogy.
They harness the sheer panic of losing a loved one and turn it into an offensive weapon. You are not going to break rank if the person you love most in the world is standing right next to you, relying on your shield.
That is the exact mechanism at play. A warrior would be far less likely to flee, to abandon his post, or to endure the lifelong disgrace of cowardice if his partner was watching him. And we see how devastatingly effective this was at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE.
Right.
The Theban commander, Epaminondas, used the Sacred Band to introduce a revolutionary battlefield tactic.
Because traditional Greek warfare was very geometric, right?
Yeah, very rigid.
Just long, flat, parallel lines of men with spears to the phalanx just pushing against each other until one side broke.
Precisely. It was usually a straightforward shoving match of endurance. But Epaminondas abandons that standard geometry completely. He takes the Sacred Band and concentrates them into a massive, heavily reinforced, deep assault column on just one wing of his army.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he stacks his best fighters 50 shields deep, and he drives that focused point of pressure straight into the elite Spartan guard.
He essentially turns his army into a battering ram.
A battering ram fueled by absolute devotion. And this deep column completely shattered the Spartan line.
I can imagine.
The psychological shock alone was devastating. The Sacred Band broke through, and they actually killed the Spartan king, Cleombrotus I, on the field.
Unbelievable.
For the first time in centuries, a Greek army decisively crushed Sparta in a pitched land battle. It permanently ended Spartan military supremacy and launched an era we call the Theban hegemony.
But the sources emphasize that Thebes didn't just invent this concept out of thin air. They rooted this radical military unit deeply in their own heroic traditions to give it legitimacy. Because the Sacred Band actually swore their oaths of loyalty at the shrine of a hero named Iolaus.
Iolaus is a crucial figure for understanding how they justified this. If you know your Greek myths, Iolaus is the nephew, the charioteer, and the closest companion of Heracles.
Right, the guy who helped with the Hydra.
Exactly. He's the one who cauterizes the necks of the Lernaean Hydra so Heracles can defeat it. But in later Greek traditions, especially in Thebes, Iolaus was explicitly revered as Heracles' romantic partner.
Oh, interesting.
So by swearing oaths at his shrine, the Thebans were holding up Iolaus as the absolute pinnacle of loyalty, devotion, and heroic solidarity.
So Heracles represents this raw, overwhelming traditional masculinity, but the unit is also intrinsically tied to Eros, the god of love.
And we have to be very careful how we define Eros for the listener in this context.
Yeah, good point.
Because we moderns hear Eros, and we immediately think of romantic, erotic desire. But in this specific military framework, Eros was viewed as a binding force of cosmic order. It was the god of self-sacrifice, devotion, and unwavering courage. Love, to them, was a martial virtue.
I have to push back a little here, or at least ask for clarity. Was this dynamic deeply romanticized by the Greeks because they were just a more open society? Or was this essentially a calculated, state-sanctioned military academy structure disguised as romance?
Wow.
Because the sources spend a lot of time contrasting the Sacred Band with a broader Greek practice called paiderastia.
That is the vital question asked, because no, it wasn't just unrestrained romance. Paiderastia, which translates to the love of boys, was a highly formalized, socially recognized relationship between an older adult male, the Erastes or lover, and an adolescent youth, the Eromenos or beloved.
Right.
Modern society tends to view these relationships almost exclusively through the lens of sexual orientation, but the ancient Greeks framed them largely as educational and civic institutions.
So it was less about romance and more like an apprenticeship for becoming a citizen.
Exactly. I mean, it was a structured mechanism to integrate young men into the civic and military life of the city-state. The older man was responsible for mentoring the youth in politics, ethics, and combat.
Okay, that makes sense.
Philosophers praised these bonds as the best way to cultivate discipline. So the Sacred Band wasn't some radical anomaly. It was simply the ultimate militarized expression of a social institution that was already designed to produce fiercely loyal, state-aligned citizens.
But this era of Theban supremacy, powered by this militarized love, it doesn't last. By 338 BCE, the Sacred Band meets its tragic end at the Battle of Chaeronea.
Yeah, a very dark day for Thebes.
They were wiped out by King Philip II of Macedon and his teenage son, Alexander the Great. And the sources say the Sacred Band refused to retreat, fighting literally to the last man.
It was a decisive, bloody end to the era of independent Greek city-states. And as Alexander takes control and launches his massive military campaigns across Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Persia, he isn't just conquering territory, he is exporting a lifestyle.
And this is where the geopolitical ripples get so fascinating. Because when Alexander's cultural tsunami, what we call Hellenism, slams into neighboring regions, it causes absolute chaos.
Oh, completely.
When that highly sexualized polytheistic gymnasium culture hits the deeply monotheistic world of Judea, you don't just get a political rebellion, you get a massive religious immune response.
It's one of the most important cultural collisions of the ancient world. You have to imagine how invasive Hellenism was. The Greeks built gymnasiums wherever they conquered.
Right.
But these weren't just places to lift weights. They were the absolute centers of Greek social, political, and educational life. And they revolved around the glorification of the naked male form, polytheistic civic rituals, and the casual acceptance of the very same-sex relationships we just discussed.
Right, so if you were a traditional Jewish leader in Judea, watching your young men flock to these gymnasiums to participate in these Greek customs, that has to look like an existential threat to your entire culture.
It was viewed as cultural annihilation. In response, Jewish writers and religious leaders began to aggressively define their identity in direct opposition to these Greek norms. This is where we see the mechanisms of religious law being utilized for cultural survival.
They basically start building a cultural firewall.
Precisely. The laws in the Torah took on a renewed, heightened emphasis. Practices like circumcision, strict dietary laws, ritual purity, and extremely rigid codes regarding sexual conduct weren't just religious duties anymore.
Right, they became boundary markers.
Exactly. Definitive, non-negotiable boundary markers. The message was engineered to be crystal clear. We do not participate in the gymnasium. We do not accept these social dynamics. We follow the covenant of one God.
Yeah.
You can read the books of the Maccabees to see just how violent this tension between traditional Jewish practices and Hellenizing influences eventually became.
It is incredible to realize that the social and military culture of the Greek Empire literally forced another community to radically reinforce its own religious boundaries just to survive.
It really is.
But then you look at our sources for how the Romans handled Greek culture, and it's a completely different playbook. The Romans didn't push Greek culture away to protect themselves. They absorbed it, and then they cynically rewrote it to serve their own imperial machine.
The Romans were unparalleled masters of ideological engineering. They had this process called syncretism, blending foreign deities into their own religious system.
Right.
But they didn't just adopt gods. They repurposed them to support unique concepts of Roman civic authority. The mythology surrounding the Greek goddess Hebe is the perfect case study for this.
Let's look at Hebe. In the Greek tradition, she is the goddess of youth, vitality, the prime of life, and her job on Mount Olympus is arguably the most important one there is.
Oh, absolutely.
She is the cupbearer to the gods. She pours the nectar and ambrosia. And since those are the literal substances that keep the gods immortal, she functionally controls the most vital resource in the universe.
She holds a position of massive prestige. She has direct intimacy with divine power. But then, in the shifting mythic timeline, she's abruptly demoted and replaced.
Right.
Zeus abducts a beautiful mortal Trojan prince named Ganymede, brings him up to Olympus, and simply hands him Hebe's job.
And what happens to Hebe? She gets married off to the newly deified hero Heracles, and her entire existence shifts from being this powerful divine executive who controls immortality to being a mother whose job is to birth immortal guards for Olympus.
Yeah, a massive demotion.
To use a modern analogy, it feels exactly like a ruthless corporate restructuring. You have a powerful female executive managing the company's most critical asset, and she gets pushed out into a traditional domestic role, while the CEO's favorite young guy just swoops in and takes her corner office.
That corporate restructuring analogy captures the power dynamics perfectly. For modern analysts, this myth is a glaring reflection of broader patriarchal systems systematically displacing female authority.
Definitely.
Ganymede's elevation carries undeniable erotic overtones and shifting power dynamics. In fact, the Romans later Latinized Ganymede's name to Catimidus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that word, Catimidus, eventually became a linguistic marker in Rome for a concubine. Having a beautiful, enslaved youth serve wine became a massive status symbol for wealthy, elite Roman men. It was a daily public broadcast of their dominance and possession.
The very dark, very calculated flex of power.
Yeah.
But the Roman engineering doesn't stop there, because the Romans take Hebe, this displaced Greek goddess of personal individual youth, and they transform her into the Roman civic deity Juventas.
Right.
And they completely change the definition of what youth actually means.
This is where we see Roman statecraft at its most manipulative. The Greek concept of Hebe was about enduring personal vitality, staying forever young and beautiful. The Roman Juventas was engineered to represent the perpetual renewal of the state's manpower. She was stripped of her individuality. Instead, she represented the collective survival and military replenishment of the Roman Republic. She was officially known as the Dea Novorum Tugitorum.
The goddess the new togas.
Exactly.
Because in Rome, coming of age wasn't just a birthday party. When a Roman boy turned 15 or 16, he took off his childhood clothes and put on the toga virilis, the plain white adult toga. And the sources point out that as a mandatory part of that ceremony, he had to go offer a coin or a tribute at the shrine of Juventus.
That ritual was the crucial mechanism of state control. It symbolized the physical and ideological transfer of that young man's energy from himself and his family directly to the state.
Wow.
His strength, his future labor, his loyalty, his blood, it all now belonged to Rome. The Romans didn't just borrow a goddess. They weaponized the very biological phase of youth and turned it into a state-owned resource to guarantee a never-ending supply of soldiers.
It is brilliant and entirely ruthless. They defined masculine duty entirely around military service, and then they structurally redefined female deities to mandate that service.
Exactly.
And the mythology reinforces this idea that Rome's manpower is eternal. There's that incredible story from the sources about her shrine on the Capitoline Hill, When the Romans were building the massive temple of Jupiter, the king of the gods, they asked all the older, smaller shrines on the hill to politely relocate. But Juventus's shrine essentially refused to move.
And how did the Roman authorities interpret that? The augurs, the official state priest, declared this an incredibly favorable omen.
Of course they did.
They publicly announced that Juventus refusing to yield to Jupiter meant that the youthful vigor of Rome would never depart the city. Rome would never grow old, because the state had engineered a system where each new generation would endlessly feed the military machine.
You just mentioned the augurs, and we really have to dive into them, because if we are talking about who is actually pulling the levers of this civic propaganda, it's these guys.
Oh, absolutely. The augurs were arguably the most powerful political operators in the Roman Republic. These were elite men, drawn almost exclusively from the wealthy senatorial class, and they held lifetime appointments.
Right.
Their entire job was to interpret the auspicia, the signs from the gods. This could be the flight patterns of birds, the direction of a lightning strike, or even the feeding habits of sacred chickens.
And the sources mentioned they had to map out a very specific sacred space before they could even look at the birds, right? Some sort of ritual grid.
Yes, the templum. And they created this grid using a very specific tool called a lichus, a curved, knotless wooden staff.
Okay.
The augur would stand on a high vantage point, hold up the lichus, and trace an invisible boundary in the sky and on the earth. Any natural signs that occurred within that specific grid were legally considered direct messages from Jupiter. And these men dressed to project absolute authority. They wore the trabea, a ceremonial toga woven with bright stripes of red and Tyrian purple.
Tyrian purple. I mean, if you know ancient history, that dye was astronomically expensive.
Oh, incredible.
It had to be imported from Phoenicia, harvested from thousands of tiny sea snails. So by wearing it, these augurs are broadcasting immense wealth, tying themselves to elite Mediterranean trade networks, and visually screaming out their authority.
It was a visual monopoly on divine power, but their real power was constitutional. Through a legal mechanism called obnunciatio, an augur could stand up and publicly announce that he had witnessed an unfavorable omen.
Right.
And that single declaration functioned as an absolute religious veto. With one bad bird sighting, an augur could force the Senate to cancel a meeting, they could halt a democratic election, or they could stop a massive military campaign in its tracks.
Which begs the obvious, cynical question. If you are an elite politician and your rival is about to win an election, how convenient is it that you happen to see a crow fly the wrong way across your imaginary sky grid?
Very convenient.
Were these men true believers who genuinely thought Jupiter was micromanaging Rome through birds? Or was this just a constitutional loophole used to filibuster their enemies?
That is the ultimate question of Roman politics, and the historical consensus leans heavily toward it being highly strategic. Cicero, who was an augur himself, explicitly records instances where elections were blocked by omens in ways that were transparently politically motivated.
I knew it.
But the brilliance of the system was that it was so deeply entrenched in military and civic law that you couldn't just ignore it.
Well, unless you're Publius Claudius Pulcher.
Exactly. The infamous incident in 249 BCE during the First Punic War. Pulcher is an arrogant Roman commander preparing for a massive naval battle against Carthage, but the sacred chickens kept on his ship refused to eat their grain.
No.
In the augural system, this is a catastrophic omen. Do not fight. But Pulcher is impatient and furious, so he throws the sacred chickens into the sea, allegedly shouting, "If they won't eat, let them drink."
I mean, as far as famous last words go, it's pretty iconic.
Iconic, but completely disastrous. He proceeds into battle, and his fleet is absolutely annihilated by the Carthaginians. Tens of thousands of Romans die. And for the Roman public, this catastrophic defeat proved that the augural system was deadly real. Violating the auspices brought destruction. It embedded the augur's power even deeper into the psyche of the Roman military structure.
If you contrast this Roman system with the Greek world, the difference in how they engineered divine communication is staggering. Because in Greece, the voice of the gods usually came through female oracles, like the Pythia at Delphi.
Right. The Greek prophetic tradition was largely ecstatic, liminal, and female-centric. A priestess would speak in these ambiguous, trance-like utterances, and it was often chaotic.
Yeah.
But the Roman system structurally stripped away that wild, ecstatic, feminine element. They replaced it with a highly formalized, legalistic bureaucracy controlled entirely by elite men. It was religion operating as a municipal department.
It feels like the ultimate expression of the Pax Romana, peace and success, through strict order, civic fraternity, and absolute male control.
Definitely.
But As our sources reveal, this hyperstructured Roman patriarchy was actually built on a foundation of something much wilder and much older. If you trace Roman military strength back to its roots, back to early kings like Servius Tullius, you don't find Romans. You find the Etruscans.
The Etruscan influence on early Rome is the hidden engine of their empire. Before Rome was an unstoppable force of marble and law, the Italian peninsula was heavily dominated by the Etruscans, who were, above all else, master metallurgists.
Right.
They controlled vast, rich deposits of iron, copper, and tin in central Italy.
And explain exactly how that metallurgy translates to Roman military dominance, because you don't just go from digging up copper to conquering the Mediterranean.
The connection is standardization. To build the kind of massive, disciplined armies Rome eventually fielded, you need tens of thousands of identical, high-quality weapons and armor plates.
Okay, yeah.
You need advanced bronze casting, deep mining techniques, and industrial-scale weapon development. The early Romans absorbed all of this technological infrastructure directly from the Etruscans. The very foundation of Roman military strength was forged in Etruscan furnaces.
And the irony is that Etruscan art gives us the most famous defining symbol of Rome itself. The bronze she-wolf, the Capitoline wolf.
It is a profound historical irony. Here you have Rome, a society that we just established, prided itself on this hyperstructured, male-dominated civic order and legalistic discipline.
Right.
And yet, they trace their mythological origin story to a wild maternal beast suckling two abandoned twins, Romulus and Remus. They weaponized female domesticity in their daily lives, but revered a wild female predator as their mother.
That is wild to think about.
And that origin is immortalized using archaic Etruscan metalwork.
It just shows how interconnected this ancient world really was. Because the Etruscans weren't just influencing Rome in a vacuum. The sources we're looking at trace trade routes that compare these Etruscan-painted tombs in central Italy to Idumean burial complexes thousands of miles away at a place called Tel Moratia in the Judean foothills.
This is where we see how merchant routes acted as the internet of the ancient world. They weren't just trading wine and olive oil, they were transferring the literal blueprints for how societies managed death and divine authority.
Right.
If you look at the underground bedrock tombs in both Italy and Judea, despite the vast geographical distance, you see the exact same architectural motifs. You see painted lions representing guardianship, bulls symbolizing divine power, and serpents representing regeneration.
They even both carve these massive structures called columbaria, these underground caves with thousands of tiny niches cut into the walls for raising pigeons and doves.
Exactly. It reflects a shared Mediterranean reservoir of symbols. Ideas about death, rebirth, and the boundary between the human and divine worlds were constantly flowing back and forth across the sea on merchant ships.
Yeah.
These weren't isolated cultures inventing everything from scratch. They were constantly borrowing, adapting, and rewriting each other's ideas to fit their own needs for control.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's take a step back and look at the whole picture we've uncovered today. We started in Thebes, unpacking the sheer pragmatism of how military commanders took the intimate panic of losing a romantic partner and weaponized it to shatter an invincible Spartan army.
Yeah.
We saw how Alexander the Great's export of that Greek lifestyle acted as an invasive force, pushing Jewish communities to draw strict religious firewalls just to protect their identity.
Right.
And we watched the Roman state ruthlessly demote a Greek goddess to turn the very biological transition of youth into a state-owned military resource, while elite men read bird flights to maintain an absolute veto over the government.
It is a breathtaking, unvarnished look at the mechanics of power. It shows us that what we often assume are natural or divine laws, how a society defines gender roles, who owes their labor to the state, how we understand coming of age and civic duty were, in many cases, consciously and meticulously engineered.
It's all structural.
Yes. These ancient societies were incredibly successful at taking fundamental human concepts and molding them into structural tools to serve their own military and economic survival.
It completely changes how you look at history.
It really does, and it leaves you with a heavy question to ponder long after we sign off. We've spent this time analyzing how ancient states engineered youth, romance, and religion for their own ends.
Yeah.
But if you look at our world today, how much of modern hustle culture, or the way we define adulthood through specific economic milestones, is just our era's version of the Roman toga ceremony? What invisible architecture is shaping your life right now?